Hi, this is Joel Blackstock with the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast. And today I sat down with someone who I've been a longtime fan of and been reading since I was in high school, David Tacey. Tacey is kind of a public intellectual in Australia. He's a writer of many books. One of the first books that brought me to Jung, called How to Read Jung, and the Jung Reader. He's a professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and he's also a professor at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. To list all of his accomplishments would take a long, long time. But Tacey is a student of anthropology, religion, sociology, and the history of psychoanalytic therapy. So he goes back and knows a lot of the history of the profession and is a very interesting writer with a lot of very unique insights. The conversation covers a lot of Jung's early life and work and exactly what Carl Jung was. Also, comparative religion, politics, and all the things in the middle. So I hope that you enjoy the interview, and I'm going to go ahead and roll that now.
That boy needs therapy.
Lying down on the couch.
Frontier psychiatry.
Well, I appreciate you getting up on a Monday morning. It's evening of the day before here. But
Yeah.
you know, it's kind of with the interviews with these. We had talked a little bit on email, but it's hard because you want to be able to have a little bit of questions to have a rail to guide people, but you also don't want to box somebody in. And you know, the amount of history that of the profession that you know, and all of the different skills that you have, it makes it hard, not to box you in when you probably could, write an essay on any of these things.
Okay, that's fine. So what do you want to ask me first?
Well, I was interested, like, in a lot of the one of the things that we talked about is just kind of because the podcast is for people who may not have like a huge vested interest, and they may not have like a ton of knowledge about all these things. They probably have encountered Jung a little bit, but I mean, one of the things we talked about is just that, like, Jung is such a big topic. People kind of cherry pick different things in a way that doesn't make sense a lot of the time, and I think American Jungianism particularly is bad about just sanitizing it, where it's almost like, well, it's religion plus supportive counseling. That's what it means to be a Jungian analyst. But they kind of discard the process or the parts of it that are maybe threatening to them or harder to do something with. I mean, do you have anything to say about that? Or
Well, Jung is a huge area. I mean, I've spent 50 years in the area, and I don't feel I've even begun to really cover all bases. Jung is a kind of a universe of thought within himself, and there's still parts of the collected works I haven't even read. They're so dense, especially the last work he did on alchemy. You virtually need a much better knowledge of Latin than I have to work through those. As you know, Jung often dropped Latin, ancient Greek, Arabic, French, Italian terms and phrases, and it's quite inhibiting. So that's why a London publisher asked me some years ago to write a book called How to Read Jung, because there's really no way that people could just dive in unprepared. Perhaps the only way of diving in unprepared would be to read his memoirs. Memories, Dreams, Reflections is a very accessible book. And the other book that's accessible is Essays on Contemporary Events. And also, of course, Man and His Symbols. But the problem with Man and His Symbols, he's deliberately trying to reach a wide audience, and it's almost a kind of a kindergarten book.
it's a publisher book,
Yeah, I mean, he's responding to the publisher in London who wanted him to do an introduction, and I think that was John Freeman who interviewed him on the BBC on a number of occasions. So that book is not terribly terrific. I'd rather suggest people start with Memories, Dreams, Reflections if they want to dive in. In the collected works, well, even to buy them is a big financial investment. But the one to start with, I think, is volume 7, 2 essays on analytical psychology, is a nice introduction to the field. When I was young, someone gave me Aeon, or Ion as it's pronounced, A-I-O-N, and that was far too advanced for me. I think I was 19 or 20, and I couldn't make head or tail of it, and too many ancient languages and too many scientific terms. So just getting your toe into the Jung field is quite a challenge for starting off.
It's hard to understand what it is. I mean, a lot of your work and John Beebe's work with MBTI brought me into it, because we're kind of in a cognitive behavioral therapy desert here. Depth psychology is just not something that you encounter. The people, if you encounter it, it's just to write it off. You know, either like, okay, Jung invented the collective unconscious and did nothing. That was the little bullet point in the Psychology 101 chapter. Moving on, and I think what gets people too is that there's a ton of phases over his life. And I mean, I have a hard time following him into the alchemy stuff. I believe that early science probably was projective, and that he's right that people were projecting psychology onto, pre-scientific science. It's just not super interesting to me personally. But there's these phases that he goes through as a person, and I think a lot of different Jungian scholars or analysts relate to different parts of those phases, and they kind of try and make that all of it, even though he changes quite a bit. And maybe doesn't know what he even thinks. He's, chewing on things as he's growing.
I've just finished reading Catafalque by Peter Kingsley, and that's a very fascinating book. Another writer from the UK, and he adopts the view, which I have a lot of sympathy with, that most Jungians have got Jung completely wrong. That they've domesticated him.
That would be my experience.
Yeah, they've turned him into a pussy cat, but actually he's a raging lion and a very dangerous and threatening thinker in the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or Schiller or any of his German forebears. And of course, one of the tendencies that America does, when someone becomes popular, America tends to make them more simple than they are. They make them somehow more digestible, more domesticated. And it's a strange habit that America has with popularizing people and often getting them wrong in the process. But Jung, according to Peter Kingsley, Jung is a full-blown mystic and a religious prophet, and that the Jungians don't want to admit this because they are invested with the idea of him being a scientist. And in fact, when I met the Jung family in Switzerland some years ago to ask for permission to write a book, which I've published, called The Jung Reader, which has come out in several languages now. That book was designed to replace Joseph Campbell's book, The Portable Jung, which was edited by Joseph Campbell in 1972, which is a long time ago. And there's been a massive amount in the Jung field written since 1972, changed our views of Jung almost completely. So I wrote that, and I met the family in their house in Zurich, and they still have this impression that Jung is a scientist. I mean, I found it really hard to understand. I mean, he's a philosopher first and foremost. He's a philosopher who works in the field of psychology. That's how I would define him. And his philosophy is, of course, extremely dependent on theology as well, and on ancient, medieval studies and classical studies. He's a kind of Renaissance man, a Renaissance thinker, and he seems to be fully have full grasp of several disciplines, including biology, anthropology, archaeology, physics. Of course, he worked with the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and before that, he worked, of course, with Einstein in Zurich. They were in the same institute together, the Polytechnic Institute, and they befriended each other. And it was Einstein who suggested to Jung that he might explore the field of synchronicity. That came from Einstein. Mm-hmm. And they both liked red wine, and they would go to Jung's holiday house at Bollingen on the lake, called the Bollingen Tower. And apparently they had rip-roaring times down there. But unfortunately, there's no record of the conversations between Einstein and Jung. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be, imagine what kind of gold mine that would be today to release this type of information.
Well, I think there was a just voracious hunger for him to create a kind of lens to view human experience that was a unified principle, the unified theory of everything. There was no discipline left out. Yes. Because like the difference in Jung, and I think what a lot of other people who are doing objective sciences is that his psychology is purely phenomenological. I mean, it is what he is feeling on the inside. He's not really worried about what is on the outside as much as what is the experience of this like. And I think exactly. In my, and you know more about this than I do, but like what I feel when you read his career is that he tries to be a scientist until he can't be anymore. And then he's worried about the perception. He's worried about this. And then he gets to a point where it's like, I can't do this scientifically. Yeah. It has to be this direct experience, descent into whatever.
That is beautifully said.
That kind of looks crazy.
May I quote you on that? That is a great quotable quote. He tries to be a scientist until he can't do it anymore. That is so good, Joel.
And there's probably some of that inner voice where, Freud is pushing him for a long time to be a scientist, get this weird new age stuff out of there so that people will respect, this profession.
Because don't forget that Freud got rid of Jung in 1913 because he felt that Jung could be seen as a prophet or a mystic or a spiritual leader.
But did Jung get rid of Freud? He's maybe still having a fight with someone who is not there for a while.
He was having a fight with someone who wasn't fighting back all his life. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can read the last pieces that Jung ever wrote in like Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Man and His Symbols. Jung is still fighting Freud, although Freud died 40 years earlier. Mm-hmm. But absolutely right about that. When they met, it must have been absolutely electric, the atmosphere. I think the first time they met, they talked nonstop for 9 or 10 hours straight. They had a lot in common, but unfortunately they had more not in common than they did have in common. But both of them were committed to the unconscious, which, by the way, Freud called it the subconscious. Mm-hmm. And Jung said, no, we can't call it the subconscious. That's too demeaning. Let's just call it the unconscious. So Freud took Jung's advice, and Freud stopped after he met Jung. He stopped using the word subconscious. But Jung also offered Freud the word complex. That was Jung's own making, which came out of his word association tests. He started to realize that people had complexes when they were asked certain words and there was a long pause. Jung figured the reason there was a long pause was because people were confused on that particular, something had triggered something in them. So Jung called it a complex, and Freud took that up. And when he split with Freud, that's when he invented his theory of psychological types, which of course is now a huge industry in its own right. Every workplace in the world uses the Myers-Briggs type.
They change
indicator.
it just enough to patent it and call it something else.
Yeah. And in fact, sometimes these people ask me to speak about this background to psychological types, introversion, extroversion. Jung uses those terms, and every time we talk about introverts and extroverts, we're quoting Jung without knowing it.
Yeah.
And that's why Jung invented that, because he could see that Freud was a different type to himself. And that part of the reason of their falling out wasn't just personal difficulties or faults, but that they were looking at the world through different lenses.
And Adler,
so,
too. I think he saw Freud, Adler,
yes,
and him so passionately and going in
precisely.
very different directions.
Yeah.
Adler probably had more in common than Freud did. But the
Exactly.
compensation and tension of opposites is a lot like,
Yes.
the shadow.
And the power struggle. Power was very important to Adler.
Well, and the idea that for every external part that's big, there is an internal part that is big, that is unseen. They're both noticing that, probably because they're sitting with Freud, who, has a lot that he never deals with.
But the problem is that Freud wasn't at all grateful. I mean, Jung spent several years of his life constructing this theory of psychological types, almost as an apology to Freud as to explain why they split. But Freud never received the gift in the right spirit. He just ignored Jung from then on. And of course, it was a very Adlerian-like power struggle between Freud and Jung. But Freud had coordinated this so-called special committee that sat in London under the leadership of Ernest Jones to try and test the scientific credibility of Jung's ideas. Naturally, Ernest Jones, who was a close associate of Freud, came up with a view that Jung's scientific ideas weren't really empirically valid, and that Jung had gone off into philosophizing. And
well, it's an intuitive and felt psychology. It's not one that you can measure or turn into a number like behaviorism or cognitive therapy to a certain.
Yeah. So, but that London group was so savage toward Jung that I actually feel that he never really recovered his reputation, that that was so influential, especially in Europe and parts of America as well, that in Canada, that Jung was sort of completely knocked out of business, and he had to rely on his close associates, most of whom, by the way, were Jewish, and yet, Freud kept claiming that Jung was anti-Semitic, and so Freud played the race card on Jung, and I've written about this extensively. And I thought it was very unfortunate because, of course, this was during the Nazi era. And so Freud was very careful to try and pin anti-Semitism on Jung during the Nazi era, which basically meant that Jung's reputation was sunk. One thing that fascinates me, Joel, is that Jung's relationship to the Nazis was on the whole a very negative one. Like, he wrote essays called Wotan, which was about the madness of Hitler. Whereas someone like Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, probably the most philosopher of the 20th century, was a full-blown member of the Nazi Party, and somehow or other,
he's rehabilitated pretty fast for some reason.
How did that happen? I mean,
or the scientist, you look at von Braun and a lot of these people who had to know about the supply chain and things that we waive and forgive them because they're useful.
Yeah, so Heidegger was forgiven. I mean, admittedly, it took a while. Heidegger was only forgiven quite relatively recently, during the 1980s, late 70s. But Jung has still got the stain of anti-Semitism, which
Well,
I think is
there's some hit pieces. I mean, I think one of the things that it may be part of the reason the Red Book got published, but Richard Knoll has these books where he attacks Jung and says all this stuff that I really just don't think is true at all. He says he
right.
was trying to start a cult, and it was like he didn't want an institute. The only reason he did it was he was like, they're going to do this with or without me, so I might as well be a little bit involved in it.
Exactly.
He asked not to be lionized after he died. There's if he was trying to be kind of a mad prophet or start a cult, he did a bad job of it. But one of the things with Knoll, because I actually read Richard Knoll's stuff before I read Jung, before I knew a lot about
Mm,
Jung, and so I was willing to kind of accept the theory, and then it was slowly like, what? Because he says that a big tenet of Jungianism, not Richard Knoll doesn't say this, but like a big part of Jung's psychology is that religion is projective. We take something internal, and then we need the world to function a certain way, and then we start to believe certain things through mythology or ritual, or and that process is how you can understand what's going on the inside and the deepest part of the unconscious. And so
mm,
as you're reading the book, and Noel essentially is like, well, yeah, the biggest organizing principle of our entire civilization and society since the Bronze Age, it doesn't correspond to psychology at all. It's just created randomly in a vacuum, totally removed from the psychology of the people making it. It's like, wait, what? I mean,
mm.
I mean, I don't. Is he Catholic or something? I mean, I guess if you're saying that the word of God is handed down in this book, then you need to separate that from psychology. But with any kind of with any kind
Mm.
of healthy perspective on religion, how can you say that none of that corresponds to a psychological state? Nothing that our psychology is not part of our religion. I mean, that we're picking these things at random to build
Yeah.
civilizations around. That's wild.
Well, I think Richard Knoll started with very malicious intent. He had obviously read some Jung, but I don't think he read him correctly. And I think that Richard Knoll had deliberately misread Jung. See, one of the big things that separates psychology and religion is the symbolic attitude.
Mm-hmm.
So in depth psychology, pretty much everything is read through the lens of symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
But Richard Knoll is persistent in his tendency to read what Jung says literally,
Yeah.
and to read it literally is to make it almost bizarre, and
And
and you
religion
could
is not literal. It's not a literal thing. I was raised
no.
Episcopalian, and
Mm,
there's a certain point that some people get to where they're like, okay, that's an allegory, that's an allegory, that's an allegory, but from here on out it's literal. The first book, there's a snake that is talking about eating fruit. Most people, maybe not everyone, but most people who are Christian in America are probably like, well, that's a myth, it's an allegory for something.
mm,
But then you get a little further in the Bible and they're like, no, but that part
yeah,
you can't. And then
yeah.
some people are willing to make the whole thing a metaphor. But it's how much your religion is in control of your life, or where you stop being a scientist
Mm.
and start being a person of faith
Well,
is where do you
I've
stop
written
that?
a whole book on this topic, so I could talk for this for an hour
Those
or
books
more.
tend to not sell a whole lot in the US. I don't know how they do in Australia. You can write books of religion and sell them, but you can't write books about religion and sell
Yeah.
them.
One of my books recently is called Religion as Metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about this question. And it says that there is a tendency for Christians to read the Old Testament metaphorically. That the Eden, Garden of Eden creation myth. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
Christians are happy to read that as a myth. One of my students said to me, "Come on," she said, "you can't take a book that starts with a talking snake literally." I thought
Some
that
people
was a good
do.
point.
I mean, I've
Yeah.
heard defenses of the snake.
But I imagine there are many people in the deep south and the Midwest of America who still read the Bible literally. That's the feeling I get. I used to live in the States some years ago. And
Texas, you used to live in Texas too, so
yeah,
there's
and a lot of people in Texas are still reading the Bible literally. they've not caught on to the modern interpretation about reading it through symbol, myth, and metaphor. In fact, I did think about calling my book Religion as Myth, but my US publisher advised me against that because in America, like in most countries, the word myth means falsehood, like it has no merit. It's just untruth. And I didn't want that because I have a very strong respect for religion, but I also have a strong respect for the intellectual reading of religion. And it was Jung who pointed out to me, one of the first people, that there's been a mistake made a long while ago of reading the Bible literally. And Jung couldn't abide the virgin birth of Jesus, for instance, and nor could he abide the physical resurrection. But he saw both of these events as very important spiritual ideas that we need to contemplate.
And he let patients, continue their religious traditions. A couple places he points people back to their religious tradition. He tells them to go back to there's the Muslim man and the Christians. So I mean, he had respect and viewed the utility of this as something that enriched life and was helpful.
Yes, he told them to go back, but he didn't tell them to go back to the literal reading of it all. Mm-hmm. So, like if you were a Christian and you lapsed out because you couldn't read it literally, Jung would support you in that lapsing out and saying, look, but go back and read it non-literally, and it'd still be it'll be more important for you than read literally. So, that's a big topic of its own, but I don't want to waste our time talking only about religion. But as you know, Jung wrote whole books and volumes on religion, psychology of religion, East and West.
American Jungians will tell you that Jung is their religion, which is a strange way to use Jung. I mean, it's a lens to understand what it is, but I don't think being a Jungian analyst is a religion in the way that some people will say.
No, in fact, Jung was deadly opposed to this idea that it's funny, the people who loved Jung and the people who hated Jung had the same view about him, mm-hmm. which was that he was starting a new religion. Mm-hmm. That's why people hated and loved him. Mm-hmm. But both were wrong because he kept saying, no, this is not what I'm doing. I'm building a psychological bridge to religion. He uses that metaphor, Joel, mm-hmm. constantly.
When he has the falling out with the priest, right? Who's kind of trying to update Christianity.
The priest in Britain called Father Victor White. Mm-hmm. He followed Jung until he published Answer to Job, 1952.
He writes a letter to Martin Buber, too, where they disagree on religion.
And there was a big falling out with Martin Buber in the Jewish tradition.
Did the Pope ever respond? I knew that he wrote a letter to the Pope being like, oh, you're making Catholicism better. Good job. This is what it's supposed to be like. And the Pope's like, of course, making Catholicism right. I'm the Pope.
Well, that was Pope Pius XII.
Did he respond to him or anything?
Who respond to who?
Did the Pope write Jung back when Jung wrote that letter?
No, he didn't. No, in fact, from that point on, Jung got banned by the Vatican because.
Don't tell the Pope he's doing a good job. That's the
Vatican is very ambivalent about Jung because one thing that Jung did was, as you said, he returned certain Catholics to Catholicism, where they'd abandoned it because they'd become enlightened or intellectually got sick of it. And the Pope actually sent Jung a blessing in 1950. It wasn't the Pope who delivered it personally, but he passed it on to the Catholic Archbishop of Zurich, whose name I can't remember. And Jung got the blessing from the Pope through the Archbishop of Zurich. I hope they realized that Jung was never even a Catholic, mm-hmm. Why he's getting blessed by the Pope was a bit of a strange.
They've banned Jung pretty much every decade since he died. It's like
Absolutely.
too many vocal clergy with podcasts and quills
Yeah.
will start to write books about Jung, and then they will come in and
Yeah.
say, "Oh no, you can't do that."
That's right. I mean, there's a huge number of Catholic priests in the world, especially in North America, who have taken Jung very seriously and written books about him. And I think the Vatican has felt very insecure about this. And as you say, about every decade, they come out with a new edict against Jung. It's hilarious, actually, because one of these things, anyone listening can Google it. It's called Jesus Christ, the Water of Life. It's online, and it's about 30 pages condemning Jung as a heretic, as a Gnostic, as a blasphemer. It's incredible, considered that the same church blessed him not too long ago. So I think they're
The
very
Catholic Church
sensitive.
does that to a lot of people. Meister Eckhart is excommunicated and then
Yes.
sainted. So there's
In fact, Meister Eckhart, the historians are now claiming, was murdered by the Vatican army on his way to Rome. He'd left Paris. He'd been called up by the Vatican, but because Eckhart had said that God has to be reborn in the human heart, and that was dangerous for the Catholic Church, because there was only one person that was close to God, and that was his son, Jesus Christ. And so Eckhart, like all mystics, basically says the whole religious drama is about every person. It's not just about one person. And there's another person I should mention in this context, the German theologian Eugene Drewermann, Drewermann, Eugene Drewermann, who's been banished by the Catholic Church. He's written 40 books on Catholicism and Jung, but only 3 of them have been translated into English. I've read them all, and they're just absolutely stunning. And I wish that somebody would translate the rest of these 40 books. But the Catholic Church was up in arms, and he got defrocked, and he can't practice as a Catholic priest anymore. That's how serious they take the challenge from Jung. So religions are very aware of Jung, but mostly it's this hysterically negative point of view. One of the things that they all have in common is misreading Jung. If I can just give you a quick example, when Jung, of course, Jung was hugely influenced by Meister Eckhart, the late medieval mystic in the Rhineland, what we call Germany today. And Jung believes that Eckhart is right about the idea that God needs to be reborn in the human soul. And so that made the authorities in Rome very negative toward Jung. But when Jung uses the word self, this is where a lot of the complication arises. He's actually borrowing the Indian idea of the self, capital
the
S.
Atman.
The Atman, yeah. And in Vatican and everywhere else, have been reading this self as the ego. And so in this long 30-page diatribe against Jung, they refer to Jung as narcissistic, egotistic, and making some kind of demonic religion out of the ego. Because the idea that we've got something in us that's in addition to the ego is not a Western idea. It's
threatening to the ego, to the hierarchies of that.
It's threatening to the ego. But the idea of God being reborn in this capital S self is, of course, standard in the East. Hinduism, Buddhism has that, of course, but a slightly different direction, because Buddhism doesn't believe in the self and it doesn't believe in God either.
Well, if
But
there's
the
not a
state,
self, what is being reincarnated? Or if there's not, there's a lot
yeah,
of, or what if there's not a self, then how did the bodhisattvas have a self to come? Different branches of Buddhism sort of
mm,
become Hinduism or Jainism again, and
yeah.
then they reintroduce the idea while
So,
claiming to not have it.
so what, in sense, what Jung is the East in the West, and he had such a hard time. He basically had Eastern insights, Eastern intuitions, but in the context of Western science.
Mm-hmm.
And Sonu Shamdasani, who's probably the leading scholar on Jung today, he lives in London, works at the
Mm-hmm.
University of London, was basically saying that the scientists disregarded Jung for being too religious, and the theologians disregarded Jung for being too mystical. And
I have
therefore,
people who call me and they're like, "Well, I want to come see you," and they schedule, and then they're like, "Well, I looked on your website and it says you do Jung, so I can't see you because I'm an atheist, or I can't see you because I'm a Christian." So you lose people. I was like, "Well, I don't, I'm wondering what you're taking me using Jungian technique to mean here," but
that's right.
yeah,
So the problem with Jung now in the universities, you don't find Jung in the universities at all anymore. I think there was a stage back in the 20s and 30s where American universities were very interested in Jung. In
mm-hmm.
fact, Freud and Jung used to go to
Campbell
America
in the
together.
70s, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Campbell
And
wasn't too upfront about his influences, though. I mean, he doesn't point people back to where he got a lot of his ideas, which I think was.
Campbell,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I dislike that about Campbell. I mean, most of his ideas are completely borrowed from Jung. But yeah, there is an American idea that America is a source country, and doesn't like always to acknowledge that many of its so-called original ideas came from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a problem. That's part of the American complex, is that it is original, and original thinking is important to it.
The
James
rugged
Hillman,
individualism and that we are the source of
yeah,
culture for the world.
yes, exactly, which is true in part about the US. I'm not wishing to be too critical, but I think that Jung's influence on Campbell and Jung's influence on people like Robert Bly and Jordan Peterson, that's another topic, and James Hillman is enormous, but there's a certain reluctance to admit. Mircea Eliade is another one who
Yeah.
was very reluctant to admit to the public that he was hugely influenced by Jung.
I was wondering, before we get off the topic of religion or take a break from it, if there's an idea, you're talking about Jung, kind of independently discovering, probably a lot like Eckhart, this Eastern idea.
Mm.
Could you say a little bit about the relationship in a Jungian conception between the self, not the ego, but the deep and aware self, and God, or the reality of God? Because there is a relationship that is interesting, in the Jungian tradition between those, but it is kind of hard to explain it.
It is. Um, Jung's model is completely based on Hinduism, which he was really influenced by. And in Hinduism, the self, as I said before, is called the Atman, Atman. And the Atman is regarded as the place in the human being, so to speak. I mean, I'm using the word place metaphorically, but the place in the human being which is in touch with Brahma, which is
Mm-hmm.
God. So the relationship between Atman and Brahma is very similar in Christianity to relationship between God the Son and God the Father. So, but in Christianity, of course, the whole idea of the Atman, as it were, is projected onto the Jesus Christ figure, and only he has this special close relationship to God the Father. So this was never even conceived as a possibility in Hinduism, because they always felt that the relationship between the human being and Brahma or God is closer than it gets in Christianity. So there are, of course, Hindu Christians who respect and appreciate the Christian story, and but Hinduism itself is really, I guess, it's a form of mysticism. So this is the thing that fascinates me, that the East doesn't need to develop mysticisms which can complement their orthodoxies, whereas in the West, in both, the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, in order to get that closeness or proximity between the human and the God, we have to develop mysticisms. So, a Jewish Kabbalah, for instance, the Christian mystical tradition, and the Islamic tradition of Sufism develop because the need to compensate the Orthodox traditions, which tend to place the human and the God far apart. But in both Hinduism and Buddhism, the two major Eastern religions, there is no need to complement the orthodoxies because they're already mysticisms.
Well, the path is there, but if you're dealing with Islam or Christianity, or you need to build the path to have the direct experience to God, because the tradition is there to keep it away from you, to give you a hierarchy and a structure and a container. And if you hang out there long enough, maybe you get bored with the container and you want to crack that open and leave the ego. And so then you have to have a mystical pathway that out of the literal interpretation.
That's exactly right. But in Catholicism has made an interesting breakthrough on this, and particularly from the theologian Karl Rahner, Rahner, the German Catholic theologian who was very influential in the Vatican II Council in the 1960s. And Vatican II Council plus Karl Rahner said that the future Christian must be a mystical person or won't be at all. So Catholicism, almost seemingly in a turnabout, an about face, has this idea that it itself should become more mystical. That's what it said in the Vatican II Council in the early 60s. But of course, what happened was that most bishops, archbishops, and cardinals didn't agree with this radical finding of Vatican II Council, so they kind of protested against it. So we find in the Catholic Church today very few priests who actually believe in this mystical direction. They want to restore the old hierarchy. They want to restore power of the clergy, because, of course, if individuals have a mystical connection to God, then really the clergy and its hierarchy is irrelevant. Because
and if you don't make room for that, the priests leave. They leave the tradition when you're not allowing that mystical pathway to exist simultaneously with the people who need the literalism and the people who need the
that's right. Metaphor. So that's why the Catholic Church is in a bit of a chaotic state at the moment, because in the 60s, the Vatican II Council was said to be a movement of the Holy Spirit. And in one of the encyclicals called The Word of God, Verbum Dei, Deo Verbum, it actually says that we want to change Catholicism to being a religion about God, to a religion of God. So they wanted to bring this. They could see that the world, especially the Western world and educated people, no longer wanted this kind of second-hand religion. They wanted the first-hand experience. And that, of course, is what Jung was saying all along. So Catholicism said that, and then it backtracked fiercely with a huge backlash from conservative bishops.
Well, the people who are kind of the most reactionary Catholics, a lot of the time that memorize all the rules and can calculate exactly how much time you spend in purgatory for each crime and sin and all that, they're the
Mm,
converts. But the
mm,
communities that have been Catholic for a long time, they tend to
mm.
develop that transcendental pathway through the saints a
Yeah,
lot of the time. And then
that's
you get
right.
the saints functioning similar to the way that in Hinduism, the different gods function as there is one God, but this is a manifestation of one need for God.
Mm,
Ganesha the elephants are construction equipment. It will remove the obstacle for you. And you
mm.
see, different cultural groups have festival. The saints start to function that way when you spend time in that world.
Absolutely. The saints do act as intermediaries, I think is the word that we're looking for here. And Mary, Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Mother of Jesus, is, of course, in Catholicism, seen as a mediator, a way, if you like. I mean, in the beginning, Christianity was called the Way, capital W, and it lost that as hierarchy, dogma, and doctrine sort of took over, and it became, as you said before, virtually became a way to keep people from God,
Mm-hmm.
to protect people from a potentially disorienting direct experience with God. Um, and that's what Jung says in his book, Psychology and Religion, that the West partly feared direct contact with the source of our being because it thought it might be utterly disorienting and
Mm-hmm.
even dismembering, even dismembering of people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well,
um,
Edinger has that great map and ego and archetype where are you familiar with the diagram where he says like this
yeah,
is the functioning church and the archetypes are being held by the container, but then when it breaks down, everyone
mm,
is having a direct experience, but they're not ready for it. And it
mm,
starts to look like psychosis if you're not ready for it. And you look at political developments like QAnon or these things where people
mm,
are engaging, that aren't quite ready with this archetypal stuff. And
no,
there's a rootlessness. There's no container. There's no hierarchy. They're not ready.
yes.
And, a lot of certain kinds of American political and religious belief are starting to look just a lot like schizophrenia, in the broad strokes
Mm.
of how they function.
No, that's right. And that's why Jung was in two minds about all this. One part of him admired the Christian churches for presenting what he called a bulwark against direct experience. He liked that idea because it protected people. I mean, the American writer Annie Dillard has written extensively about this. Do you know Annie Dillard?
I'm not familiar.
No, she's written a number of books. And one of her books, she says, people in churches who ask the Holy Spirit to come down upon them and bless them have no idea what they're asking for. And she says they should wear safety helmets on their heads in case what they're asking for actually does happen. And they should go in with those bicycle helmets, hard hats. And she's a mystical writer in the United States, and I love her work very much. Um, Teaching a Stone to Talk is one of her books.
Yeah, I have heard
And
that title.
yeah, and another book is called, I think it's called Holy, Holy Ground, Holy the Ground, something like that. And she obviously is on the same page here as Jung. And Jung says that that Christianity is dying because people aren't having first-hand experiences of the source of their being, and that the church is too much of a bulwark and a defensive wall against direct experience. But as you said, people who want direct experience can end up and do end up schizophrenic because we're not used to it. You see, we're not used to. We don't have mm, the
The
values,
ego is that
expectations.
organizing principle of the psyche. When
No,
you get rid of it
yes,
entirely, there is no
yeah,
organizing principle. Something
mm,
like Newman talking about centroversion and the process that
mm,
when animals are evolving, into humans, there are all these instinctual reactions, and there get to be so many There needs to be a central principle that can choose between them. And when you just completely just destroy that, you're not functioning.
So Jung used to say that the West is ahead of the East with technology and science, but the East is way ahead of the West in terms of religion, mysticism, and the numinous, the experience of the divine. And I think that in the East, in India in particular, and also, of course, Tibet, China's in a different position because it's been officially atheist since Mao Zedong, although I can see a reaction happening quite soon in China as people are not going to be happy with this atheism.
But when you go to China and you ask them what their religion is, they're like, well, we're atheist, and then we're going to burn all of this paper money so that our ancestral spirit can have it in the afterlife during the funeral, and then we're going to, and you're like, wait a minute, so you do, no, we're atheists, we're communists, we're atheists, and they'll continue to tell you about. And I mean, and the Americans do the same thing. When you turn mythology into something that is scary and of the past, you're blind to how it is functioning in the present. And then it is unconscious and in control of
you. There are a lot of Chinese here in Australia where I live. In fact, in my city, Melbourne, I looked it up recently, there are 485,000 Chinese in my city. So it's just under 500,000 Chinese in my city alone. The reason they're here is because the standard of living here is very high. In fact, the standard of living in Australia, if you don't mind me saying, is higher than America.
Sure.
Because we have free public health. You can go and see the doctor and it all is free. We don't have that fiasco that you had about Obamacare and things like that. We have a system which is quite similar to Sweden. Health services are free, and there's lots of doctors and lots of nurses, and of course, food here is relatively cheap compared to China, where it's expensive. So a lot of Chinese are coming here. But I've met several Chinese. I had quite a few Chinese students when I taught at the university. And yes, I'd ask them, do they have a religion? And the first answer was always no, because they're supposed to be atheists. But after you talk to them a bit, they say they pray to the deities and that they light incense and candles and have intermediaries that they worship. So it's a kind of a schizophrenic culture, really. Or perhaps that's a bit harsh. Perhaps
it's the same as America. You turn everything into a religion and then you don't see religion anymore. And so people aren't aware that their politics have become that, or, that we don't. Even atheism is like a religion in the United States. When someone becomes an atheist, they have to be enlightened and they're superior and they're very Freudian and intellectual. And it's like your whole life is about this lack of belief in something that is itself a religion you are creating.
It's a religion particularly in it's dogmatism and the way it can, basically shapes your whole life. But I've found with the Chinese that it's almost like, to use Jungian terms, the persona versus the soul. The persona of the Chinese is atheist, but the soul is not atheist and never has been. And so this suggests that China is a very dangerous country, because if the persona and the soul are out of whack and they don't actually relate to each other, then the potential for splitting of the personality, schizophrenia or dissociation, is always there. That's happened to my sister. She, like me, was brought up very religious. I had a totally full-on religious upbringing, and so did my sister. She rejected it intellectually as she became more educated. She read existentialism and Freud and Nietzsche, and she got me reading existentialism when I was about 17, which was probably too young to understand existentialism. But after a while, she clung to this atheist idea and became progressively schizophrenic. And I did speak to her about it, and she thought I was part of the devil, because she developed paranoia. But my family is Irish, and the Irish are inherently religious, no two ways about it. if you say you're atheist in Ireland, you're basically lying. You're trying to be an atheist, but your soul is still religious. So with my sister, she said she was atheist, but actually she was of the same psyche that I had. And I can't get rid of religion. I've tried to, but I can't, and I don't want to anymore because.
Well, I don't know that anyone can. It's are you honest about it and how it is functioning in your life? Are you conscious of
Yes.
that? I mean, going back to China, the persona can turn on a dime, but the soul can't. You have this modernist Marxist cultural project where you come in and say, okay, everybody's atheist now. This is what you believe, and this new way of life. You can do that in 50 years, but you can't get rid of the history and the body, like that is still this felt rootedness
Thousands of years of
ancestor
Taoism,
worship and families
ancestor worship, and sort of Buddhism as well. Apparently, Richard Wilhelm, or Richard Wilhelm, as we say in English, wrote a book in the 40s called The Soul of China. But of course, he wrote it before Mao Zedong. And a friend of mine is sending me this book. It's in the mail now. I can't wait to read it because I think The Soul of China is going to come up again. And when that comes up again, we're going to get a very different China to the one we see today, with Xi Jinping as the presiding oligarch over the whole thing of 1.6 billion people, which makes America look small in terms of the population. And as for my country, we have fewer people than you have in California. And so we're sitting at the foot of China.
There's sheep farms in Australia that are the size of Alabama. With very few people on them.
Well, America, when I lived in America, they called Australia British Texans.
Yeah.
We have wide horizons with nothing in them, it's massive continent. It's the same size as America, Australia, geographically, without Alaska. But we only have 24 million people in this massive country. And so we are, I think, quite afraid of China because it's in an aggressive expansionist mood at the moment. It's clearly already moved on Hong Kong, taken it back. And it's about to, of course, despite Nancy Pelosi's visits, take Taiwan back. That's expressed policy of current Chinese political strategy. And of course, they will probably come closer. They took over South Vietnam. And of course, as you well know, America fought that war and lost it. And Australia supported America fighting against the communists from the north.
Well, and there's a lot of building projects and things in Africa, where they're building hospitals, roads, bridges for mental rights. And there was a funny Twitter exchange a couple months ago where somebody was like, the Chinese are, the Africans want the Chinese to come. They don't want the Americans and the British. And the saying is, when the Chinese come, we get a hospital. When the Americans and the British come, we get a lecture. And a British and an American person responded on the thing, and they said, "Well, you have to understand, there's no such thing as a free lunch and communist." And then an African said, and "There goes the lecture."
That is so funny. That is so true. Australians are like Americans. We happily give out lectures to countries, like Africa, African. I think
well, you give out a little bit more healthcare than the States, so.
And the British too give them lectures, but China wants to build hospitals and schools. Not only Africa, but this is all the Pacific Islands, like Samoa, Fiji, all these countries in the Pacific. China wants them as strategic bases for their expansionist policy. This expansionist policy is for some reason called the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road policy. And of course, naturally, America is shaking in its boots because
change of the world order and our mythology is under threat. That no one can.
The whole world order is under threat.
No one can do anything without us approving of it, and that myth is ending. And Americans resist making a new myth.
Yes, the American myth is basically that it rules the world. That it's the policeman of the world, and China's in the process of challenging that, and already has outmaneuvered with America in terms of its gross national product and its economic development. So Australia, as one of the very close allies of America, is shaking because we're wondering if we've made allies with the wrong country. we made allies with America after the Second World War. America saved Australia from the Japanese, just as it saved Europe from Hitler. As well, America did a massive amount of good work in the Second World War, but its Pacific theatre was focused on helping Australia save our country, and they did a marvelous job. But now we're wondering whether we need a better alliance with China. So we too feel totally confused about the world order. But we're talking politics now. The religious thing is bubbling away under the surface. I mean,
always.
And it's hard to know what the answer will be about China on the brink of some kind of religious breakthrough. I used to teach at the Jung Institute in Zurich for quite a few years, actually 10 years. And most of my students were Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Thailand, Taiwan, also Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Koreans were there in huge numbers. And I would think to myself, what's going on in Asia? Why are they so hungry for Jung? And the biggest pop band in the world is called BTS. And their work is all based on Jung. They've released a series of albums based on the book by Murray Stein called The Map of the Soul. They released an album called The Persona, and then something called Archetypes and something about soul. And that's the biggest selling band in the world. So there's some very extraordinary things going on in Asia at the moment. And of course, in Russia, there are extraordinary things too. The Russian Orthodox Church has rebonded with the Russian government. So there's no disconnect anymore between the Russian church and the Russian state.
Well,
so, this is an extraordinary thing, which is unprecedented. We used to think of Russia as a secular country, and a communist, of course, based on Marx. But now I think the Marxist stuff's flying away quickly. And there's this sort of fundamentalist fusion between religion and the state. And Russia is a very dangerous country, of course, always has been, and probably always will be. So the whole world order is shifting under our feet.
Well, it's a dangerous world. I mean, I think the bigger through line in our conversation has been the benefits and the risks of direct experience. And I know that you have said that you're not super comfortable talking about clinical realities or therapy, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know why. You feel like you know more about therapy than probably most clinicians, at least the ones that send resumes to me. And like
Now. Be polite.
No, I'm not, and I'm not saying that they're not good clinicians. It's that we don't teach the history of the profession. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy came in the 80s, and it's just the ego is all there is. Here's some ego management strategies. Clap your hands and tell the anxiety to stop. Yeah. And I mean, what I notice too is like the institutes, the Jungian institutes in the 80s become incredibly analytical. I mean, they're analyzing trauma, but they're not treating it. And they're, somebody who has a dissociative disorder, you're telling them about the myth of Pericles, but you're not doing any kind of direct experience. There's this distance. And then out of those institutes, a lot of Jungian analysts leave, like Arnold Mendel, and who does process therapy, and Sidra and Hal Stone that do voice dialogue. And the thing that those have in common is that they're directly experiential. One, they're not analytical styles. They're based on Jung's map, but then also they're somatic. They're using the body, Can you say anything about that, or do you know anything about that point with the institutes?
Well, I think you're right. And I think there's been a book recently written about this, which I mentioned before, Peter Kingsley,
Not familiar.
Catafalque. Catafalque. Catafalque is something to do with ceremonies in funerals. The book subtitle of the book is C.G. Jung and the End of Humanity, which is a rather dramatic sounding title. But I think that the Jungian project is in danger of, if not already, has lost its soul, actually.
There's a lot of infighting in the institutes. I don't know
Yeah.
the politics behind those, but there's like 3 competing ones now where people
Yeah.
left and made their own. And I mean,
Well, in London, which I'm very familiar with because I'm often in London, there are 5 competing Jungian institutes.
it's already a small piece of clinicians are Jungian. I mean, to be cutting those into fractions seems like a
Freud had a wonderful phrase for this. He called it the narcissism of minor differences. And I'm working for, next week, I'm actually working for one of the London institutes, and they're sort of not friendly with the other Jungian institutes. So it's
what are the
just
disagreements? I mean, why do they fight?
this fighting indicates the field is fragmented, to say the least. And being fragmented, how can it function properly? So I think you're right. And a lot of people that get disillusioned with Jungian clinical training. For instance, I was giving a series of lectures last month in October 2022, and there was a fellow came on who was studying at the Jung Institute in Zurich, and I was giving contextual lectures about where Jung had come from, what are the major influences on his thinking from Germany and, of course, Switzerland and France, etc. And he said at the end that they never get taught that at the Jung Institute. They just get the kind of, these are the archetypes, this is the shadow, this is the ego. They just get that model taught to them, but they don't get the whole intellectual development of the field.
It's why a lot of Jungian clinicians don't know how to apply it. They know how to talk about it, but I mean, it's a map, but you need a technique. And I think you just get stuck in analysis forever, and you never directly encounter any of these things, or if you do, it's on accident. I mean, one maybe good jumping off point into James Hillman in the Red Book is talking about direct experience. If anyone isn't familiar who's listening, James Hillman is the first non-provisional director of the Institute. And he, by all accounts, he's a very good analyst and a brilliant mind, but never really deals with a lot of things going on. Maybe the father wound that brings a ton of male Jungians into the Jungian lens. He, has a falling out with the Institute, develops archetypal theology or archetypal, what do you call it? Archetypal psychology, which I think no one really ever figured out how to practice it, including Hillman. He came up with something that he could talk about, but he did not know how to do it, because he took the idea of the self and the ego away. And I mean, everything that I can tell about archetypal psychology is that you basically push people into a pagan religious experience with no intellect and no sense of self, and the symbol becomes reality. And I mean, I don't know what that would do, but it doesn't sound helpful. And I never really found any accounts of Hillman even doing that as an analyst.
Do you know that I worked with Hillman for 3 years?
Yeah, so that was why we wanted to get your perspective. What I'd heard you say before, and correct me where I'm wrong here, is that your institute had sent you to work with Hillman, and then Hillman decided that you didn't know as much as he did, and so that you couldn't guest host the radio show, but he wanted to analyze you, which seems kind of arrogant there. I mean, people who don't have the vocabulary or the learning that I have, I'm not bored by. They're still interesting conversations. I mean, or at least, I mean, that seems like strange. So then he said that you should become his patient, basically.
Yes. Don't forget, though, the age difference. I started working with Hillman when I was 28. I'm now 70. When I was 28, Hillman was, I think, 58. So there were 30 years difference, so he was a good generation or more older than me. And my institution, which was funded by New York, Harkness Foundation in New York City, wanted me to have conversations with Hillman that might end up in books published about so-called post-Jungian psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And but Hillman is was such a controversial figure. You know, he'd been, as you said, he'd been booted out of Zurich because he was too radical.
Well, he also slept with a patient, and then
he slept with a patient who happened to be the wife of a clergyman.
Yeah.
In Switzerland, it scandalized everybody.
His analyst C.A. Meyer, I mean, he was kind of in a fight with his mentor too, which was maybe why he was acting out like that. Did you know C.A. Meyer, anything about him?
No,
he
I
seemed
didn't know.
to not be a popular person when you.
No, I didn't know C.A. Meyer. I knew Marie-Louise von Franz,
Mm-hmm.
and I met Edward Edinger, and I met Robert Johnson and June Singer, and all these sorts of people.
Those ones are probably more fun to meet. Meyer,
yeah,
Thomas
More, I think, was one of the best of the lot. Actually, Tom More, very grounded fellow, an excellent man.
Until his writing reminds me of James Hollis. They seem similar.
Yes, James Hollis is also a good friend of mine. Used to live in Texas. I think he lives in Washington, D.C. now.
Yeah, beautiful writer.
Yeah, Thomas More used to live close to me in Texas, and then he moved up to, I think, in the Boston, Cambridge area. And where were we? We were saying
we were talking about just Hillman being your mentor, and that he was kind of a talented analyst who wanted to develop something that wasn't Jungian, that was Hillmanian, but I don't think he ever found the words for it.
No, you're exactly right. I don't know how you know so much about this stuff, because you're a young man. How do you know so much?
I've just read everything. I mean, I think the profession is, you should know the history of the profession, and then that means that you read the papers these people publish, and you get a sense of their psychology, and you get a sense of the things going on in the institutes.
You know as much as I do, so I should be interviewing you. But you're half my age, and but look, frankly, you're absolutely right. Everything you say is spot on, and that is that Hillman wanted to go beyond Jung, and he bragged about it in a fashion which I thought was a bit offensive. Actually, Jung was a genius.
You read things like the Soul's Code, and he's talking about his discovery, but not able to articulate what it is. It's a trope or a truism, and he's not ever. He never was really able to, I think, separate from Jung in a mature way. You have this kind of father wound that brings. I mean, and Hillman, really, I wanted to lead into a larger question, which is, I mean, this maybe sounds a little controversial, but I worry for myself. I mean, do you think that male Jungians go nuts at the end of their life? Do all of them do that? Because there seem to be a lot of people who, they have an over-identified anima, they have heightened intuitive feelings, sense, and probably some pain, and they're attracted to this psychology, and then they get in it, and they start to get to the end of their career, and then they're angry, like, well, I didn't get to save the world. I did everything right. I mapped all this stuff out. I taught forever, but the world is still a mess. Why am I not the Messiah? And you see them. I mean, Hillman was yelling on right-wing talk radio at the end of his life about how we'd been doing therapy for 40 years and the world wasn't better. So what was the point? And it was like, these problems have gone on since the Bronze Age. You're not going to fix them, but that isn't the reason that we try.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know too much. You know too much. I mean, I don't even need to tell you.
Well, but I think you were there. I mean, I'm listening to the recordings of this, and some torrent that I downloaded in college, like a big computer file of all these Jungian talks and appearances, but I don't.
I think a lot of Jungian men do go a bit awry at the end of their careers. They've developed a close, as you say, an identified anima. They've often got strong intuition and feeling. their relationship with reality is often rather tenuous,
Yeah.
because they've been
Which makes them
focused.
effective when they're young, and it makes them
Yeah, but
errors when they're
it makes
dying,
them,
essentially.
like, toward the end of his life, Hillman, I think, had a deep father wound.
Mhm.
A deep father wound. That's why he joined up with Robert Bly,
Mhm.
because Robert Bly trades on the father wound.
And so
You
did
know?
Moore. I mean, all of those guys. I mean, Moore was a little nicer than Bly, but he still had this tendency to be evangelical about the
You
shadow.
mean Robert Moore?
You're Robert Moore.
Yeah, I thought you might talk about Tom Moore.
Oh,
Tom
no,
Moore's
no.
different, but
Robert
certainly
Moore would
Robert.
would talk about the shadow like he was an evangelical pastor sometimes.
And you
Um,
know that poor Robert Moore's life ended very tragically.
well, it's funny because I didn't know that when I was reading him, but it was scaring me because he's so gentle
Yeah,
and kind. And then he would
yeah,
start talking about, no, but the shadow is 100% evil and black. And if you take a step in there, it will eat you alive and you can never integrate it. And it was like,
yeah,
this is anti-Jungian. There's something in you that is very dark and very
yeah.
scary. And then I was reading more about him and come to find out, I mean, there were medical things going on too, but
Mhm.
he does essentially shoot himself and his wife, at the end of his life as a
Yeah.
gentle.
It ended. His life ended tragically in a suicide murder.
Mhm,
And what does that say about Jungian psychology? It
mm.
says how dangerous it is. Um, Robert Moore, I loved his work, but like you, I sensed there was something unresolved in it.
Mhm.
His stuff on the shadow wasn't good.
No,
Um,
it was like the Satanic Panic. I mean,
yes,
it was wild. I mean, just so reactionary and
yes.
against his whole
I, w-
persona.
I was shocked for years when I found that he'd shot himself in the head, after shooting his wife.
Mm.
And it just left me speechless. These people are supposed to be the guardians of our soul.
But if
And
there's
that's
things
the,
in us that we don't ever directly experience, that we just
yeah.
describe, that comes out. And I think that's why psychology is changing. And I think that, I mean, that's kind of the through line of this conversation. You can do it in religion, politics, whatever. But
Mm,
you feel when you read Hillman that something's wrong, that,
yeah,
and you feel when you read more that something's wrong. You read
yes.
James Hollis and you feel like that person is a lot better actualized and okay. I don't
I
get
feel that
afraid.
James Hollis is quite integrated.
Yeah, there's
Um,
nothing in there that is a red flag.
no, but there were red flags in Robert Moore and red flags in Hillman.
And they
And
start men's rights movements. All of those
mm,
guys go kind of right wing and start these men's right movements at the end of their career.
I don't know if you've read my essays on Hillman, have you, or not?
I read The Unmaking of a Psychologist, and then I read all the people who were jumping on to critique that with their responses.
Well, I
I
published
used
the.
to pay for the Wiley Library, and I got so sick of dealing with the Wiley Library. They would send me my login information 6 months later, and I would be like, "Well, can I have 6 months free or refunded?" No, you can't, and that's just finally so over it.
Well, I can send anyone who's listening who wants them. I can send them to you for free. I have the PDF files,
Mhm,
but I basically said in those essays, which, by the way, I published in Britain, not in America,
mhm.
because I thought there were too many fans of Hillman in America who would object to what I had to say. But
He
I
was
basically,
so many Americans' first experience with Jung. That was
yeah.
just the way they knew of it.
But the father wound is huge in Hillman, and he he enacted it with Jung. He
Mhm,
tried to basically say that he'd gone beyond Jung. He's better than Jung. But I think you nailed it earlier when you said that in his practice, Hillman was still Jungian. I
mhm,
once asked him at the end of a session, I said, Jim, everything that we've done is so Jungian. I'm waiting for the Hillman part. And he just looked at me and he said, I haven't yet developed a
mhm.
practice in line with my theory, so that there was a big gap between his practice and his theory. You read him and he's telling everyone how post Jungian he is. But being in analysis with him, as I was, he was unbelievably orthodox Jungian.
Mhm.
I couldn't even tell one bit of the analysis that wasn't purely Jungian.
I heard
So
him yelling about how Jungianism removes the symbol by analyzing it, and you have to go into the symbol. And I heard him yelling about archetypal psychology. I never heard a case study of him practicing it that I could
no,
find anywhere.
no, he didn't. He doesn't have even one case study in all of his 24 books, which tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, in Jung's work is full of case studies.
Well,
Often
he was when you start trying to give other people the medicine you need, you're saying that other people need to have a direct experience.
yeah,
It's one that you haven't had. And I think
yeah.
he wanted some kind of ego dissolving spiritual transcendental moment that he never was able to find or go into.
He
Um,
did he did toward the end was aware of what he was missing. In
the
fact,
Red
if you
Book maybe was that experience for him.
yes, very good point, the Red Book. But also there's a book called Archetypal Process. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, that's one that is on my eBay alerts, but it's very expensive. So it was
Yeah,
just like your Routledge books. If somebody sells one used and they don't know what it's worth, I'll buy it, but I don't have them on
so
right now.
it's called Archetypal Process. It was edited by David Ray Griffin.
Mhm.
The subtitle of Archetypal Process is Jung, Whitehead, and Hillman. And Hillman writes some fascinating stuff in there, and he admits that his work is missing a whole dimension,
Mhm.
which is the metaphysical, the spiritual dimension.
Mhm.
Just
That he was
yesterday,
longing for so much that he almost was trying to like resurrect paganism or something, you know.
exactly, he was trying to resurrect paganism. He hated Christianity, partly because he was Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
but he also hated Judaism.
Mm-hmm. He did not
So,
like monotheism. He wanted the
no,
divine to be broken up into.
he didn't like any form of monotheism, whether his own Judaism or Christianity. And he didn't like Islam either. So he wanted us to go back to the Greek pantheon,
Mm-hmm.
the polytheism of the Greeks.
I think he
That,
would have gone even farther back. He wanted us to go back to the mother cult, to the Venus figurines of the Stone Age.
I don't know if you can hear the torrential rain pounding on my roof here.
I'm not able to. Yeah.
That's good. So anyway, I think when I was studying with Hillman and being analysed by him, there's a fellow called Ralph Maud came down from Alberta, Canada, and he asked Hillman a question which I thought was completely spot on. He said, "How come your work is asking us to go back to the religion of the ancient Greeks before Christianity? You're asking us to basically worship people like Athena and Artemis and Aphrodite. They're all, of course, the female goddesses. He wasn't terribly interested in the male gods, except for Hermes, I think.
Yeah, I
And
really do think he wanted to go back to the
yeah,
Venus of Willendorf, and crawl into a
yeah,
cave of the Great Mother. Yeah.
and anyway, this guy from Alberta said, "Why should we go back to the Greek religion when even the Greeks got rid of their own polytheism in favor of Christianity? Because the Greeks were one of the first cultures of the world to convert to Christianity." And he says to Hillman, "Why did the Greeks lose faith and belief in their own religions, their own many polytheisms?" And Hillman couldn't answer it. So there was he was just silent. It's a great question.
And that didn't happen often with Hillman when he was asked a
No,
question.
he basically had nothing to say. And I suppose the visitor from Canada basically thought to himself, touche,
Mm.
I've checkmate.
Have you read The Lament for the Dead that Hillman and Sanu Samshadani both
Yes.
wrote? You
In
have
fact,
read
I
it?
reviewed that for a British journal.
Oh, I didn't
Yes.
know that you had written a review of it. I have to look that up. I was
Yeah.
impressed. I mean, I'm not wild. I mean, it seemed to be, and especially in the
Yeah.
beginning, some of the best writing that Hillman did. It's
Yes.
thoughtful and there's
Yes.
depth to it. I liked it.
Yeah, me too. I liked it as well. And I like anything that Sonu Shamdasani does. I think he's a very balanced. One of the good things about Sonu Shamdasani is that he's a scholar. He's not a clinician.
Mm-hmm.
He's an historian of Jung's ideas, and he knows the whole context in which it all occurs. And naturally, he's of course the editor of the Red Book as well.
Yeah.
So
he kind of is the reason it was published too. I mean, you have Richard Knoll who's attacking Jung, so maybe that motivates the family to want to defend him. But I mean, my understanding was Sonu basically got these copies of where Jung had mailed the Red Book to the publisher, but it was not a complete draft, and said, unless you let me publish the big one, I'm going to publish the imperfect one. And then the family gave him permission.
That's right. But actually, coming back to the Red Book, I think what we can see there is that direct experience of the god or the gods or the noumena or whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. I'm not attached to a particular language, is very disruptive. I mean, Jung's Red Book is basically an analysis of his own psychosis.
Yeah. I think he could not find an analyst for him, and he tried to basically become that.
No, he tried to analyze himself through his own psychosis. And I think it's rather coy and shy of the Jungians to constantly refer to this phase of his life as his creative encounter with the unconscious. You know, anyone with half an inkling about psychiatry can see that Jung was struggling with a full-blown psychosis. And even
there's debate about how much of it was a loss of control and how much was active imagination, and what mindset is he in when he's doing this, because he was seeing patients. I mean, he was punching the clock. He's peeling the meat off his soul to talk directly to God, and then clocking out and going to the
don't forget what I said to you about China. I think Jung was a good example of China. His persona was still intact. He was still acting as a respectable psychiatrist with his patients, but within himself, he was a seething cauldron of psychotic activity. Like he's a volcano that had exploded. And
but
that's
he knew
why
it. He wanted to make it conscious and go all the way to the bottom.
Yeah, he did. And he went all the way to the bottom. He does say in some of his essays that the psyche is like a volcano, which can blow its top at any moment. Well, of course,
and it's in all of us. It's in all of us, whether or not we pretend that it isn't there or wish it away or try and cling to the ego.
He experienced that partly. It's a father wound. Talk about coming back to the father wound. I mean, Jung was terribly wounded by his father, because Jung wanted to help his father understand the interior dimension of Christianity, but his father wasn't interested in any interior dimension. He basically thought his son was mad. And then
and he had lost his own faith, his father had. So he was refusing the pathway that was being offered to him to try and reconcile some of his persona. And
I think it's a classic case of healing the Oedipal complex. Jung had outdone his father, but he didn't want to destroy his father like Oedipus did. He wanted to remake his father. He wanted to redeem his father. And of course, then the whole thing gets acted out with Freud.
And Meyer, and then Meyer through Hillman, and then it's to a certain extent I would be fascinated to know how much a father complex came up and what Hillman was telling you about your analysis.
Well, it won't surprise you to learn that my analysis was about my father wound.
Yeah, we give other people the medicine that we need, but don't want to take.
I mean, I have had a very big father wound, and I fronted up to Hillman one day. I just said, "Guess what, Jim?" He said, "What's happening?" I said, "My father has decided to come over here and meet you and talk with me about my analysis." And Hillman said, "Oh, this is getting close."
He wasn't so brave anymore.
My father just, this is where synchronicity hits the road. The rubber hits the road. I was working on my father complex, and my father felt it. It doesn't matter that I was in America and he was 12,000 miles away in Australia. He felt it in the psyche knows no
And it could
time
be
or
through a
space.
small gap of communication and
Yes.
inflection of tone.
Yes.
I mean, so much of
And,
what we're aware of is not what we're aware of.
so coming back to Jung, he split with Freud, really totally fragmented him, and a psychosis resulted which Jungians pretend to domesticate as some kind of.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Is you don't like the Red Book, whereas I do. Most Jungians do. I agree with you that most people, they sanitize it and they act like, oh, he made this beautiful work of art. Isn't his diary cool?
No, it's
Doesn't it
not
look
like that.
alchemical? And it was like, no, this is a deep and profound suffering that is partially reconciled because it is an unreconcilable pain, that he's going into. And
pain, huge pain. I'm astonished.
But you think that it's him trying to be too prophetic, or you don't like the presentation of the tone in the book, the persona of the author?
I don't like the tone of the book. I was asked to write on it by Murray Stein in Zurich, and I did. But I told Murray, I don't like the Red Book. I think it's psychotic. I think that the prophetic tone is too strong. I find it too strident. Chapters called Things Which Are to Come, or Things Which Have Yet to Come,
or Seven Sermons to the Dead. It's written in the tone of like the Bible almost.
Well, it's like people scraping their fingernails down a blackboard or something. It just got on my nerves. And
well, if he was coming down the mountain with it to bring it to the masses and starting a cult and treating himself like the prophet and making Jordan Peterson type YouTube videos, I think that would be a problem. But it was something he chewed on privately, which, I feel like I chew on things privately through art and writing, and it doesn't look that good.
Know. Frankly, I think Jung had every right to do the Red Book to save himself from schizophrenia, basically. But I don't know if we have a right to read it.
Do you think he would have published it?
No.
He did go to publishers at one point. He thought about it.
Yeah, but I don't think. I think his better mind would have convinced him not to get it published.
And there's rooms in Bollingen that the family is still guarding. No one knows what's in there.
Yeah.
No one knows the paintings.
There are whole chapters of his autobiography that still haven't been published because they're scandalous. I was sitting on a casket once in Zurich, and the fellow who owned the premises came in. He said, "You know what you're sitting on?" I said, "No." He said, "There are 3 chapters in there from Memories, Dreams, Reflections that the family has refused to allow to be published. One of the chapters was on his marriage to his wife. Another chapter was on his lifelong affair with his mistress, Tony Wolfe, which the family didn't want to become public."
Did they have an arrangement? I mean, she was traveling with him and Emma at some point. So, I mean, we could hypothesize it was...
They had an arrangement, but feminists today would say, bully for you, your bloody arrangement, Why didn't your wife have a lover? Jung basically said, "I need my lover because she is my anima." Well, today that just wouldn't wash.
Well, there are places where he's strangely conservative, like you bring up in the How to Read Jung book that his theories about anima and his own writing paved the way for a sexual psychology and politics that he says is not right, but he's opening the door to that. And the implications of what he is saying is that, that this is part of us. And I mean, and I think they talk about it in the Lament for the Dead too, but there's places where he wants the descent and then the return. He doesn't want anyone to just descend into things. So when the modernists or the transcendentalists go way far into their abstract art, he hates it. He wants them to go there, feel that, and then come back and bring it into the world of the ego, which is, that's kind of a conservative position, not politically, but
very conservative. So Jung was a bag of contradictions, So he gave us the entrance into the study of bisexuality in the psyche, talking about the anima in men and the animus in women. James Hillman blew that out of the water when he said, if the anima is an archetype, why should it be limited to men? And if the animus is an archetype, why should it be limited to women? And so Hillman spoke about anima and animus in men and women, which is one of the ways, by the way, that Hillman was genuinely post-Jungian, because Jungians don't subscribe to that theory.
Mm-hmm.
That Hillman used Jung's logic against his own argument. And I agreed with Hillman on that. I thought that was a bit of an advance. But if you read Jung's essay called Women in Europe, which talks about the increasing masculinization of women, and he could see right back in the 20s that women were becoming more masculine. They were becoming more like men. And in my country, and I'm sure in yours, women now demand the right to do the same sports that men do. So
he was relatively culturally conservative too. And that, I mean, I don't think there was, I mean, there's places that are definitely problematic by today's standards of what is okay to say about race. But he had this attitude of it's okay to go adventure in India. It's okay to go look at yoga, but you don't do it. You're white. You can't do that. I mean, and I'm trying to read him with some grace, but that's in there, you know.
It is in there. And just as I was saying before, his essay, Women in Europe, ends up with this rather deadening sentence. He said, men should remain men and women should remain women.
And maybe if there had been, you know, a talk radio or something, it would have been Jung who became the crank at the end of his life. And, you know,
and I don't
even
know
Campbell was kind of headed that way. I mean, there's kind of, he died pretty early, but there's some bizarre talks at the end of his life where he's screaming at college students about being Marxist and stuff. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No. So I don't know what Jung would have said about transsexual operations.
I doubt he would have liked that.
No, when men becoming women and women becoming men, he would have been outrageously against it. He would say that if you're a man and you identify with your feminine side, then what happens to your masculine side? He'd say it would fall into the unconscious, become repressed, and then it would come back and haunt you.
Well, but if you're not able to hold your anima to the point where you're saying that you need to have a harem because it doesn't fit into your wife, that maybe is a, you know, there's maybe something going on in him.
Well, and he had
even harem. Toni Wolff couldn't deal with the alchemy. I mean, she basically left because he got too into alchemy.
Yeah. No, Toni Wolff, of course, ran with his theory of types. In fact, I think it was Toni Wolff who suggested the theory of types to Jung, and he took it up and developed it. Just as it was the other woman that Jung had a big affair with, Sabina Spielrein from Russia.
Some people, he wrote in the book that they made music together, or like it was kind of allegorical. Do you feel like that was a sexual affair? There's disagreements. Yes. It was.
No. Have you seen the film A Dangerous Method?
I do. I don't know that I agree with, I mean, the S&M part of it or whatever. But
I don't know what's true and what's not true, except it's important to know that the movie.
The conversations between him and Freud are almost complete transaction, or like they're like complete transcriptions of what he wrote that they had, like the rap in the bookcase.
The director of that film, that Canadian fellow.
Is it Fincher? Did Fincher do that one?
I can't remember who it was, but he was a Freudian. So he had an agenda, which was to make Jung look bad. And he certainly did make Jung look bad in A Dangerous Method. And he made Jung look like a beast of sexuality with those scenes with Sabina Spielrein. But anyway, the point I was making was that it was Sabina Spielrein who said to Jung that she felt there was a masculine element in women and a feminine element in men in a conversation during their sexual affair. I don't know if that S&M stuff happened at all. That could be just part of the movie. But Jung said that's a great idea. And he ran with it and developed his theory of contrasexuality. So, you know, Jung owed a lot to the women around him and who worked with him, especially Toni Wolff and Sabina Spielrein. but he didn't always give them the acknowledgement that they deserved. So he was a typical patriarch, a man of his time. And what kind of an appalling life did Emma Jung have as he went
And
off?
she was the one that paid for all of it. I mean, it was her
She
dime,
bailed him
basically.
out. Yeah.
He
When
couldn't
he
have
had,
explored any of that without the funding that she
I
allowed,
agree.
because it was not a
She
profitable endeavor
she was very rich, one of the richest women in Switzerland. And he lost his job. He had to give up his job because he was going psychotic at the
that
University
scene
of
in the
Zurich.
movie I do love, where Freud and Jung are going to the different places on the boat, and Freud is trying to have this father posture and have authority over Jung, and then Jung is going upstairs because his wife has booked him first class, and Freud is going down into the
Because
and Jung kind of says, "Oh, I'm sorry, my wife booked the tickets. I didn't
yes,
do it."
it's a
And
great scene, isn't it?
yeah,
Yes. I love that moment, actually. It's quite moving because Freud was the one without money.
and he was
And Jung,
Jewish too. I mean, he dealt with
yeah,
anti-Semitism a lot.
yeah. And Jung had a fortune. So he didn't need to work. He didn't even need to see patients because they had enough money. And his financial situation was very secure. And so, and then, of course, late in life, well, midlife actually, a lot of American rich people came over to Switzerland to fund him as well, like the Mellons.
Yeah.
And, the Mellons who had been funding major universities. I think it was Yale University, and set up the Bollingen series with Princeton University Press. They paid for all of that so that Jung's German writings could all be translated into English and published in America. That he didn't pay for any of that. It was all funded by his benefactors. So he had a dream run when it comes to money. It was never an issue, not like most of us. Money is a big issue, and it was for Freud as well.
Well, that's
But
the
Freud,
reason taproot therapy existed. Is I left to start this because I was tired of being forced to kick patients out when they didn't have insurance, and I wanted to be
I
able
can
to.
remember a famous line that Hillman told me while I was working with him in Texas, and he said everybody's worried about how to terminate an analysis. When does the transference end? And he said to me, and there were others there in the room, the transference ends when the client runs out of money.
I don't know how you afford to be in analysis for 7 years or whatever before you go to Zurich and get your second master's degree to get the analytical training.
I know.
Maybe that's one of the reasons that Jungianism is dying as a pure practice.
Well, it's so expensive. That's why it's dying. But there are some analysts who have a social conscience and a sliding scale. So, if you don't have enough money, some analysts will see you anyway, charge you less. But Hillman didn't seem to have a sliding scale. I paid the standard fee.
Well, he knew that he could get the money out of the institute that was sending you over, probably.
He knew that I was being funded by big money, and he wanted a share of that too, and as he did. And I don't begrudge him that, because he gave me a lot of time. I saw him twice a week for 3 years, except when he was in Japan. He was always heading off to Japan.
I don't know that part of his life. I wonder what was interested to him there.
Japanese were very interested in his stuff. And the Japanese Jungians today are very much shaped by Hillman's ideas.
The architect Leon Creer, who did Poundbury, England, and he's an urban planner, new urbanist. But we had interviewed him. Leon Creer. He designed the town Poundbury, England, for Prince Charles in England, and then he did some like communities here, the new urbanist communities like Seaside.
Oh yeah.
He's older. We interviewed him on this about some of the Jungian applications in visual archetypes and architecture, and he had met Hillman, and he told me that Hillman told him when you go to Europe, the buildings, the eye is pulled up so that you look at heaven, and when you go to an American building, there's a drop ceiling with a fluorescent light so that you look at hell. And thought that was pretty funny.
Oh dear. But look, Hillman hasn't made much impression in the United Kingdom. They don't like him. They see him as a kind of a trickster and an egotistical maniac.
He's too much of a rebel. I mean, the British
Mm.
like a kind of authoritarian or
They do.
traditional thing, and his thing was to
Yeah.
blow up every tradition for no reason.
Yes, exactly. And the British don't like that. And as for Australia, here, no one in my country's ever heard of Hillman.
Mm-hmm.
And they wonder why I spent so much time with him. Well, he was a major figure.
Mm-hmm.
And probably one of the first truly creative Jungians who reached out to a broader audience, particularly that book you mentioned. We've had 1,000 years, or no, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know, though, that he was on right-wing radio about that. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so the a lot of the talks that I have, I don't know when they were recorded. I don't know what they are. The recording quality is awful, and they've been ripped from basically analog tapes. So when I was getting into Jung, there was like a giant file that somebody had put up on the internet. Shared files on something called BitTorrent at that point. And so it's just terabytes and terabytes of Jungian talks. And so I heard everything Moore, Hillman, Bly, all these people said for their entire careers. But so you heard it change too, because, they talked, from the 70s until the 90s, a lot of them, Call Shed and all the, and so, but one of the appearances was Hillman on the radio, kind of having this reactionary. He was talking to, I don't know the name of the program, but he was saying basically like, therapy's making us weak. We have to be tougher, and it's just the kind of reactionary stuff that seems silly.
Hillman went to a peace conference during the early 1980s in New York, and gave this most crazy talk about the need for war. And I said to him, "Why did you do that for? I mean, you're trying hard to make yourself unpopular. Imagine going to a peace conference and talking up war."
He couldn't help it. It was this unconscious trickster and rebellious boy.
Rebellious.
He wanted somebody to put him in his place and tell him.
Denise Levertov almost smashed him at that conference. I mean, she basically said, "How dare you come here and talk about the virtues of war?" And then he had the temerity to write a whole book on it, called "The Need for War" or something. Do you know that book?
This is The Glorious Love of War, and that's a different author.
Yes,
Is that Hillman?
Yeah, The Glorious Love of War. I mean, what crazy crap was that all about? I mean, anyone with their right mind wouldn't pray.
I mean, like I said, you've got these Jungians with this wound, and the males, they over-identify with the anima in early life, and then they get the only taste of power that they've had, and then they way over-identify with the animus, and they become, dangerous. It's strange.
Dangerous. I was totally against this bullshit about him praising war. And he said, "Don't worry, David, I have Mars accented strongly in my astrological chart." I said, "I don't care what Mars is doing in your chart. I'm more interested in the well-being of the Earth and our future as a civilization."
Yeah, in a time with nukes, you want to talk about, Greeks went out in the phalanx and it made men, so we should extinct the planet with radiation.
I mean, Freud used to complain that Jung was off with the fairies, but I tell you what, Hillman was off with the fairies as well. And this idea that we need to give Mars a prominent place. Well, I mean, the tradition of Western civilization has been one Mars catastrophe after another. The First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War.
Hillman wasn't joining the army. I mean, he was telling other people to go to war. He wasn't signing up for a mercenary company. He was sitting in an armchair. He was in his Eames chair writing about how great war was.
I just said to him, "This is just bonkers. This is crazy stuff." He said, I can't remember what he said, but I was so appalled. And then the next thing I heard, it linked up Robert Bly with a men's movement, which of course attracted angry men, young men. And
who needed help. I mean, the same thing, you know, a lot of those people that, I mean, because that's just, those people are a dime a dozen on YouTube now of, you know,
Yeah,
you have to eat more red meat and women are trying to make you weak and all this
yeah,
stuff. And,
all that
but they
stuff.
get you in the
Yeah.
door with self-help. That's just cognitive psychology. It's not, you know,
So
the tips work, but then the
yeah,
prescription after that is that you have to believe all this crazy stuff.
I wrote a book denouncing Hillman and Bly in regard to this stuff about men. You mightn't have seen it, but
No one, just the basic insecurity of it is so obvious. I mean, I was like, I
yeah,
remember people saying stuff like that when I was 13, when I was an angry young man, and I was
yeah,
just like, no one would say this unless they were deeply insecure.
yeah.
Like,
But Robert Bly hated that book. I called it Remaking Men. Um, I don't think it was even published in the States. It was published in London.
I'd never heard of it.
No, published in Melbourne, which is where I live. And in London, it sold quite well, but I don't think it even touched ground on the US. But Robert Bly read it and he wrote me this furious letter about, you know, blah, 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 blah. He was just so angry. And Hillman was angry too. And in fact, at the end of his letter, Bly said, I'm going to tell Hillman about all this and blah, blah,
Like
blah.
he was your dad?
Yeah.
Like,
I'm going to tell your dad how naughty you've been.
I just imagining grown men, you know, saying some of these things is beyond the pale.
He threatened. Yeah, he said, he said, I'm writing this letter on a plane because
I wanted it to be kept secret. That's why I wrote it in a book and published it.
But anyway, I think that beware the Jungians, you know, I mean, some of them are brilliant. Tom Moore is brilliant and maintained his brilliance. And I think we can rely on James Hollis and Robert Johnson's books are very good, although they're not intellectually oriented. And Robert Johnson's not so good on gender politics. I think he's very, very old-fashioned about men and women and
About
gender.
the only person that Hillman even worked with for a while without fighting with him was Michael Mead. I mean, Michael Mead was like the only person that he actually liked. But Michael Mead is so kind of out there and spacey that I think they just didn't have enough of an ego to butt heads. But he basically fell out with everyone else, you know, because Michael Mead was just drumming and chanting, and so there was no ego to threaten Hillman's, you know, brilliance.
I think Hillman and Tom Moore, I don't think they had a falling out, but I do think that they had some disagreements. I think basically on jealousy. Hillman was so jealous about Tom Moore's success. And
was
there was
he
a big
of means? I mean, did he want more financial success?
Yes. Hillman kept saying to me he had no superannuation and he wanted more money. And there's his student writing millions and millions of copies of The Care of the Soul. I think good on Tom. I think he wrote some terrific stuff. But Hillman wrote basically as an intellectual for intellectuals. You know, you can't read Revisioning Psychology without having studied philosophy, psychology, and sociology at university. It doesn't make sense. So Hillman was writing for highly educated people, whereas Tom Moore stepped down the ladder and basically wrote for a much broader audience. And Hillman was very
Jungians tend to know way too much. I mean, because it's like to make those connections, you have to know sociology, anthropology, comparative religion, you know, ancient history, and in order just to get your foot in the door. And it's like, who has all that?
That's right. No, nobody has all that. So, I mean, to read Hillman properly, you need to be about 40 years old and have at least 2 or 3 degrees to make sense of it. That's why I think he sold himself short when he teamed up with Robert Bly. You know, you got the worst of Hillman coming out, and the best of Hillman was written in the 70s and 80s. And I think that none of the Hillman fans had the maturity or the education to actually understand early Hillman, which was the main Hillman.
Well, he started to try and write more broad mainstream, but when he got he couldn't quite get rid of the intellectual bent, and so it was just pretension. There was no.
Well, one of his books became a bestseller. I think it was The Soul's Code. Yeah. And I think he got off on the opera show, Oprah Winfrey show.
Oh yeah, I didn't know he appeared on there.
And there was his superannuation nest egg that he'd always
Mhm.
wanted. So he did achieve a degree of popular success. But I don't think The Soul's Code is a very interesting book.
It kind of fails conceptually, and it's not really a theory that I don't know. I mean, there's some interesting and poetic bits of it, but it isn't.
No, it's not as good as Tom Moore. Tom had the right recipe, to go public, as did Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson's books sold in millions.
Yeah.
His books, He, She, We, his other book called Ecstasy. There was another book by him called Inner Work for HarperCollins. HarperCollins made a fortune out of Robert Johnson. He's often not talked about. I think the envy toward Robert Johnson, who lived in San Diego, was so high that the Jungians couldn't stand even reading him.
Well, Hillman was well known as a speaker, and he was well known in different countries that kind of liked him. But so many Jungians around him were becoming rich. I mean, Clarissa Pinkola Estes and they were just the 70s and 80s was like the Jungian heyday. And he could never really articulate what he was doing in a way that grabbed that zeitgeist in any kind of interesting way.
Robert Bly made a fortune out of Jung, writing that book Iron John, based on a Jungian reading of the fairy tale of Iron John. So a lot of people were making massive money. I mean, Joseph Campbell made a fortune out of Jung, especially with The Power of Myth, the TV series, which was pure Jung, but he didn't say it was, and that's what annoyed me.
Even his talks on schizophrenia and things, like he's saying that, and it's like this, you're quoting case studies, you have to attribute this.
So I don't think the Jungian heyday's over, by the way, Joel. I think we're going to get more and more of it. It's come in waves. The 80s was a wave, and the early 90s was a wave. You had, as you said, Clarissa Pinkola.
I think right now is too with younger people. It's just that they don't have any money, at least in the US. Like when we were opening Taproot, when I was meeting with the person who was helping me plan it.
And then there was a big wave with the Red Book. There was a big wave with that South Korean boy band I mentioned, BTS, the biggest selling album in the history of Korea. It's just going to go on and on because there's something vital in Jung that it has a future. Freud, however, is just going to get more and more looking passé, out of date.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell actually has a pretty good quote where he said, I read Jung and I read Freud when I was younger, and I thought they were both interesting. And then I read Jung and Freud again 5 years later, and I didn't get anything else out of Freud. But Jung got hit different. And then I read him again 5 years later, and I got something else out of the same Jung, but I didn't get anything out of Freud. And finally, I just quit rereading Freud and only read Jung. And it does grow with you over your life in a way that Freud is kind of a one-note thinker.
I still read Freud because he's such a great writer. He writes in a beautiful, succinct style.
Well, there's just an efficiency to the way he presents information.
Yeah, I love the way he presents his ideas, even though I disagree with most of them. But I still admire Freud as a stylist. I admire Hillman as a stylist and don't always agree with him either. And I tried to reread Hillman's Revisioning Psychology a couple of years ago, and it was like grating on me a bit. He was too flashy. He was trying to sort of flash his credentials around. I think he wrote that book in order to get a top-notch job in an Ivy League Northeast American university, but nobody took the bait. He did deliver those lectures at Yale University for the Terry Lectures. Jung delivered Terry Lectures too, which were called Psychology and Religion. And Hillman, I think there were too many intellectuals that worried about Hillman, and worried about his flashy style. And
well, I mean, if you want to work in an institution, you cannot be the rebel. There's the college does not make
No.
this person who wants to blow things up, even if they're right. You know, I worked in a hospital for a while, and there's this attitude of, well, Sarah has a good idea, but Tiffany has a PhD, and we sell PhDs here. So do your time, and then we'll listen to your
I
good
mean,
ideas.
Hillman eventually took a job at the University of Dallas, which was a Catholic university. I don't know what he was doing in a Catholic university, but it was. And of course, he ended up getting sacked.
Yeah.
Because he was a rebel and they didn't want him there.
Mm-hmm.
The psychology department said, "You're not a psychologist." And the philosophy
He probably would have agreed with that too.
I think he did agree.
Yeah.
And the philosophy department said, "You're not a philosopher either," And there was this.
Well, you cross both of those worlds. Your career is English and anthropology and psychology and philosophy.
Well, it's a bit like Jung. You see, if you become too disciplinary, the university system doesn't like you because you don't fit anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Jung didn't fit in psychology and he didn't fit in philosophy, nor did Hillman, nor did he fit anywhere. So the university these days just don't even bother with Jung or Hillman. I think I said it something where if you become too multidisciplinary, the universities think you become undisciplined, literally undisciplined, and you're not following the code of any of the established disciplines. So Hillman was booted out of Dallas University. And by the time I worked with him, he and some of his friends in Texas had formed a new institute called the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, which was formed by Robert Sardello. Do you know his work?
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, I think he's written some very fine work in recent years. He's explored the relationship between Jung and Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, and of course Gail Thomas and the Louise and Donald Cowan from the University of Dallas all formed this Dallas Institute. And my sponsors from New York came down to check it out, but they weren't impressed. They just saw it as some sort of breakaway group that don't fit into the university system. They came down to the Dallas Institute and they said to me, "We want you back up northeast." And one guy looked at me and he said, "There's no good can come out of Texas." And I think he meant it, a real New Yorker. And of course, I don't know if he was quoting scripture, but in the New Testament it says, "No, there can be no good come out of Nazareth." Someone says, I think it's someone called Nathaniel in the Bible. I'm not sure if he was quoting or it was just a coincidence, but the New York sponsors were not impressed by Hillman or the Dallas Institute. But I fought against them. I said, "I'm here and I'm staying here." And so, I really enjoyed my time at the Dallas Institute. And I loved my time with Hillman as my analyst. I thought it was fantastic. And he helped me through my father complex. That's priceless.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know I had a father complex.
Was the analysis, were you confronting things in a directly experiential way, or was it a pretty intellectual kind of analysis? Because
no, it was quite experiential.
Well, that's good. Maybe that's what he was trying to figure out a way to do.
Hillman was good at, but unfortunately, none of that was translated into his writings.
Yeah, that's what's missing. That's so strange. Is he's talking about direct experience, but then he wants to be a detached intellectual, and it's like
that's right.
It doesn't work, because in my experience with Jungian analysis, it's like I know these complexes, I can feel it, and I'm analyzing it, and they still have a hold on me. You have to be pushed into going into the dark place, and if he probably was effective at pushing people. I mean, Hillman was effective at pushing people.
Yeah, I think so. I think Hillman did a lot of good as an analyst, and I certainly have nothing but praise for him at that level. It's only his career that I'm critical of. I had one analyst. I had another analysis before I went to America with a woman, and that analysis was on my mother complex, and that was very successful. But I still have a mother complex. I think these things, you don't get rid of them. I still have a father complex, even though I worked on it with Hillman. Or it's just that I know them better. It's not that I've got rid of them. I know them now. I know my father complex. I know my mother complex. They're friends of mine, close friends, and I draw from them. And they draw from me too and make demands on me. So I don't think this idea that you work on the unconscious in order to go to a higher or better place, I don't subscribe to that at all. I think you just go back to where you started and know the place for the first time, to quote T.S. Eliot.
The Fisher King, that you're going back to the same place you were as a child, but you're
you go back to where you began. I go back to where I began and know it for the first time, and that's got a lovely, warm feeling to it. And I thank Hillman for that, and I thank my first analyst, Janice Dorr, for that too. So I have enormous good feelings, and I'm still in analysis today with someone because he's so good with dreams. I'm not so good with my own dreams.
Have you ever tried brain spotting? Have you ever heard of that?
Who?
Brain spotting. It's a newer brain-based medicine therapy technique.
Oh, I've heard of them. Yes. I've heard of brain spotting. Yeah, but no, I haven't.
It's wildly psychedelic. You're just looking at a pointer. I mean, that's it. There's not, the person is looking at a spot where your eye dilates, but it digs up really amazingly profound dreams very quickly. If you're into dream work, I'd recommend, and it only takes 30 minutes to do it, and then you're done. So. I mean, I would recommend finding somebody if you're interested in dream work, because I'd love to know your experience with it. Because I'd been in every kind of therapy that exists, or I mean, of course, not every kind, but I don't think you get the training. I think you actually have to be in it as a patient. And Jungian analysis is very different.
Well, that's the way Jungian analysis works.
Yeah, and but that I was in analysis, but I also did internal family systems. I also did cognitive behavioral therapy. I did these different things, and 40 minutes of brain spotting in my life was just different. I felt this awful physical feeling, and I realized I'd been trying to run from that and turn that off my whole life. And then just 2 or 3 days of wild emotional experiences and prophetic dreams, and it tends to be the experience patients have. I mean, it's growing. I think that's the future of a lot of trauma work.
Wow, that's a very good wrap. Yeah, I think we better finish up here.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to take any more of your time, but it's fascinating.
No, it's fine. I'm very happy. You seem to know so much, as I keep saying. It's a great pleasure talking to you.
Well, maybe the podcast is just kind of an ongoing thing, so I'm sure we could talk again on another topic.
We
at
can.
Some point.
But
we've got a lot of stuff about Jung and architecture coming up. There's one of a British academic is doing a lot of work on Bollingen, so we're trying to find a time to connect, and different things about archetypal applications in architecture is kind of an interest of mine. So,
is that Lucy Huskinson?
No, I emailed her, and then she said Martin Gledhill was her friend that was doing it, and so I talked to him, and I think his name is Martin Gledhill. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
I've got 2 books by Lucy Huskinson on architecture and archetypes.
She said she was working on Nietzsche now, so it wasn't a good time to talk about you.
She's always working on Nietzsche. She did her PhD on Nietzsche as well. But she's a very bright woman who lives in Wales and works at the University of North Wales there. She does some great work in architecture. But I'm out of my depth with architecture. I can't speak about the topic.
Well, my dad is an architect, so maybe that's a father complex. I don't know.
Oh, well, there you go. Say no more.
Well, it's funny, the synchronicity. Like when I wrote this article on Leon Creer's design, and he's a big deal that's older, and I'm writing on a therapy blog in Birmingham, Alabama, so it's like you don't expect him to see it. But I was writing it, and then I was like, well, my dad's an architect, and I'm writing about architecture, but I'm a social worker. So what if people see it and they're like, well, you don't understand architecture good, and somebody might see it think whatever, and then Leon Creer sent me an email and it's like, this is great. Let's
that's
talk about
nice. Yeah, that's great. Well,
It's
that's
funny.
terrific. But you've obviously got a father connection with architecture. I don't have. Yeah.
Well,
So yeah.
do you what I usually do with the podcast is I put it out on YouTube, and then I also put it out on our podcast, the audio of it. Is there anything that you want to promote or point people to go back to? I mean, you have a lot of books. Anything that you want to promote,
I
that's
should
older,
have a
newer?
website, but I don't seem to have a website. I don't too old fashioned. But yeah, I've done 16 books on the topics that we're talking about. Some of them you've never heard of, I can tell. That doesn't matter. I don't care about
I
things
buy
like
them when
that.
I can find them, but I've got a couple of
I'm
yours.
not a very good self-promoter, you know. I don't promote myself. I just think that if people are ready to read my stuff, they'll find it. But you know, I
A
have a
lot of it finds
Wikipedia.
a new life on Audible, that people have these audiobooks. And so somebody who
Yeah.
wrote a book 10, 20 years ago, they do an audio version and then sales explode. So maybe investing in somebody to read them would promote the sales.
Someone kindly wrote me a Wikipedia page. So if you key in my name, a
Hmm.
Wikipedia, but it's not updated, unfortunately. It hasn't got all of my stuff in it.
The
Uh,
criticisms of James Hillman on his page here mentioned on that Wikipedia page too.
are they?
Yeah, on James Hillman, there's criticisms of him, and I think they cite it probably is on Making of a Psychologist. I'm not sure what they're citing, but
Oh, right.
there's
Okay.
some mentions there too.
I think it was a fellow from Norway that did that page for me, but I certainly wasn't me or someone that I know. I looked one day and saw there's a Wikipedia page on there. It's sort of like magic. But I don't have a website, as I said, which I should change. And I should get into the 21st century.
Sure. Well, if you need help, let me know. We built one for work, so it's fairly easy now to get a template and you link to your books and different
Right,
things.
right.
It's just kind of like making a Word document at this point.
Hmm. Anyway, it's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so
Um,
much for your time. We ran over, and I appreciate you making time to sit down with us because I mean, it is fascinating to hear directly from you. You read somebody's books, you get a sense of who they are, but then you still have questions about
yeah,
the way that
yeah.
details about things that you don't know until you ask. So it's
No,
fascinating, and I'm sure people will love to hear your insights into all these things.
thank you. Well, and as I said, I've lived in the States, so I have a taste about what America is like. And I saw the good and I saw the bad. I was walking down Washington, D.C. one day, and this guy came crashing out of this department store with stolen goods. And then these police screaming, "Stop or we'll shoot." I thought only in America could I see a scene like that. And I was scared stiff because that doesn't happen in Australia. We're not big on guns here at all. You never hear of people or police shooting people in Australia. It just doesn't happen. Um, and they started firing at this guy, and I was just beside myself with terror and sorrow for this guy. I don't know what he stole, but it was certainly not worth him losing his life.
Mhm.
He might have stolen some sort of hi-fi or a TV or something, but America scares me about the guns there, all those guns. We don't have guns here. It's illegal to carry a gun in my country,
Mhm.
but not in yours. I know, you know, it's very different. The right
There,
of Americans to bear arms is in the Constitution.
it is. There's it is a very different culture from a lot of the world. But I
Yeah,
think that we've kicked the can down the road on a lot of problems for a long time
yeah,
that we
yeah.
can't kick it anymore. I mean,
Well,
climate change is a whole nother conversation, but I mean, Australia
I
is
know.
maybe the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
things creating bigger problems there
I
sooner
think
than.
the world is so tired of waking up and turning on the news and finding there's been yet another American massacre in a
Mhm.
shopping center or a school or a movie house. We're just so tired of it. We don't, not to mention you people. But
we don't even see it anymore. I mean, I had patients were calling to be seen for a workplace shooting, and I didn't even hear about it. I didn't even know what it was.
Well, they're so common, they're
Yeah.
so common. The states are scary. I'd rather live in my country. You walk, you're free here to walk anywhere and you won't be shot. No one's going to shoot you. A lot of Americans are moving to Australia partly because of this. We're a very different culture. A lot of people think we're very American, but we are and we aren't. So it's a mixed bag, actually. Anyway, I'm getting hungry. You must be tired.
Yeah.
What time is it there for you?
It's about 8:30 at night.
Oh,
So I need to get my kids to bed. But I really appreciate your time and just your body of work. It's really nice to meet you and talk to you because I've been reading it since college. So thank you so much. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you very much, and keep in touch.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. Take care.
Bye.